It was a glitchy app. It didn't always do what I wanted, but I don't remember ever getting angry at it. Sometimes it worked great. Not infrequently there were issues, but never once did I object. You see, it was a beta app. When a new app or website launches, or when they launch some new feature, they commonly go public before their actual release for a period of time that's called the beta version. You all know this. For example, back in the 18th century when Gmail was first launched, Google first launched it not as Gmail, but as a beta site because they knew it had issues, they knew it was broken, they knew it didn't work, and they needed people to test it and report back what wasn't working. The idea is that it's got availability, but with the understanding that you will absolutely find bugs in it. And so you don't get angry because it's not a finished product ready to be rolled off the presses. It's a developing product that's still very much in process. If you don't want to use it, don't use it. If you want to use it, you know it's a work in progress, you're welcome to it. The site is not making any claims to have everything worked out to perfection. If you find a problem with a beta app, you think to yourself, oh yeah, this is a beta app. Maybe I should send the designers an email so that they know that they have a problem. If you're a mature person, you don't get angry at a beta app because it's a beta version. You know, if a link is broken, if it's glitchy, if a feature's not working, you understand. A beta app is a grace-expected app. The beta app is counting on you to give them grace because they're not claiming to be anything that's perfect. And Jesus founded his church in the first century as a beta church. And everyone who follows him at the very best of their life, you're a beta Christian. Welcome to Memorial Beta Church. I'm Beta Greg. Pleased to meet you. You know, but it's a grace-expected app. Because we're not perfect. We haven't arrived. We don't have it together. We are glitchy. We don't always do what we're supposed to do. And you expect that. When somebody, lets me down, I just figure they're the beta version. And the grace is expected within the family of God. And when, I let you down, I rely upon you to say, oh, this is the beta Greg. He's glitchy. Grace is expected, because we're beta Christians in a beta church, as a beta family, very much in process people, a grace-expected app. And yet it can be hard to live this out. When it does capture your heart, though, when you realize that God made you to be a beta app, and you can rest in that confidence that he doesn't hate you, he's not mad at you, you are forgiven, and you are embraced, and he's not complaining about you because you're a beta app. When you get that, it reaches inside of you, can set you free. We're going to look at a passage from Mark chapter 7 and then a little bit from Mark 8. This is God's gospel as Jesus shows us a surprising first. Mark 7, beginning in verse 24. Jesus left that place and went to the vicinity of Tyre. He entered a house and didn't want anyone to know it, yet he couldn't keep his presence secret. In fact, as soon as she heard about him, a woman whose little daughter was possessed by an evil spirit came and fell at his feet, and the woman was Greek, born in Syrian Phoenicia, and she begged Jesus to drive this demon out of her daughter. First, let the children eat all they want, he told her. For it is not right to take the children's bread and toss it to their dogs. Yes, Lord, she replied, but even the dogs under the table eat the children's crumbs. Then Jesus told her, for such a reply, you may go. The demon has left your daughter. She went home and found her child lying on the bed and the demon gone. Then Jesus left the vicinity of Tyre, and he went through Sidon down to the Sea of Galilee and into the region of the Decapolis. There, some people brought to him a man who was deaf and who could hardly talk, and they begged him to place his hand on the man. After he took him aside, away from the crowd, Jesus put his fingers into the man's ears, and then he spit and touched the man's tongue. And he looked up to heaven and with a deep sigh said to him, Ephphatha, which means be opened. At this, the man's ears were opened, his tongue was loosened, and he began to speak plainly. Jesus commanded them not to tell anyone, but the more he did so, the more they kept talking about it. People were overwhelmed with amazement. He's done everything well, they said. He even makes the deaf hear and the mute speak. Jesus and his disciples went on to the villages around Caesarea Philippi, and on the way he asked them, "Who do people say I am?" They replied, "Some say John the Baptist, others say Elijah, and still others one of the prophets." "But what about you?" he asked. "Who do you say I am?" And Peter answered, "You are the Christ." Jesus warned them not to tell anyone about him. He then began to teach them that the Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders, the chief priests, and the teachers of the law, and that he must be killed and after 3 days rise again. He spoke plainly about this, and Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. But when Jesus turned and looked at his disciples, he rebuked Peter. "Get behind me, Satan," he said. "You do not have in mind the things of God, but the things of men." What do we see here? We see a surprising first. Realize where Jesus is. He's in the vicinity of Tyre, which is a pagan area. He's left Palestine and moved north up into the Roman province of Syria, what today is Lebanon. And Tyre was a Phoenician city, fabulously wealthy. To this day, it's one of the oldest continually inhabited cities on the planet. And it was very wealthy because of its sea trade, but these were Gentiles. These were not Jews. These were not people who were looking for a Messiah or a Christ. Jesus had left and gone to a pagan Gentile city that was fabulously wealthy, and this Gentile woman born in the area comes seeking out Jesus. We read that the woman was a Greek born in Syrian Phoenicia. That could mean one of two things. Either she was ethnically Greek but was from a merchant family that had traveled there, or more than likely, Greek is used as a synonym for Gentile, meaning she was actually Phoenician, and Greek is just a generic term. But she begged Jesus to drive the demon out of her daughter. So this woman is a Gentile woman, not a Jewish woman, ethnically Phoenician, Greek, and she's got a little girl that's suffering from some kind of spiritual oppression because some kind of hostile intelligence is oppressing her. Literally, she has a demon. And Jesus' response to her request leaves us from our cultural distance kind of scratching our head, because she begged Jesus to drive the demon out of her daughter. And Jesus says, "First let the children eat all they want. It wouldn't be right to take the children's bread and toss it to their dogs." She's begging Jesus to help her daughter. Literally, she fell at his feet in the Greek, and she kept asking for her daughter's release. She's being persistent. She's not letting go. She's nagging Jesus. And Jesus calls her a dog. What's going on? What he's trying to explain, and that she would have understood, is that he was the Jewish Messiah. And the Jewish people were in covenant with God. And a dog in Jewish law was an unclean animal. And so dog was used as a euphemism for Gentile. In fact, sometimes they said Gentile dogs. He's not saying, "You look like a dog." That would be a very American insult. No, he's talking about the difference. And the term dog here is actually, it's the diminutive of a little dog or a puppy. It's the cute version. And it's a household dog, a dog that one keeps inside their home and that sits under the table as they eat. But he's explaining, I have come first to save the Jewish people, and it would be wrong for me to take what they need and give it to you first. And it seems harsh, but it wasn't harsh. He's talking about the ceremonial status, and he's saying, I first came for my fellow Jews. I can't take the kids' food and give it to the pet. But this is a surprising first, because this Syrian woman, Gentile woman, is the first person in the gospel according to Mark who actually gets the gospel, who actually gets grace. She doesn't take offense. She doesn't get defensive. She offers no objection to Jesus prioritizing the Jewish people. She has no objection to being told that she's not one of the children, that she's not one of the covenant people, that she's the pet. She says, "Yes, Lord, but even the dogs under the table eat the children's crumbs." She accepts that she's the puppy, and she has absolutely no right to sit at the table at this point to enjoy the feast. She knows Jesus owes her nothing. Nothing at all. Jesus owes her nothing, and she gets it, and she still asks persistently. She knows Jesus has the power of God. She's putting all her eggs in the Jesus basket. She's saying, Lord Jesus, you owe, and she calls him Lord, you owe me nothing, but I am looking to you for grace. Grace because you owe me nothing. I haven't honored you. I haven't lived my life for God. I have no claim to be a child of God. I have nothing on you, but I am still here, Jesus, and I am bowing before you, and I am asking you in your own name to take care of my daughter and to bless her and liberate her, because I'm the family pet, and the family pet gets the crumbs that fall off the children's table. It's the beauty of the gospel is that all you need is nothing. But most people don't have that. All you need is nothing. And she knows she has nothing. It's an amazing first. The first person to understand grace in the gospel according to Mark is not even Jewish, not even in the covenant with God, but only at this point being engrafted into it, because she's turning to Jesus. The first person to realize that grace is all we have is her. God owes her nothing, and she knows it, and she's still trusting Jesus to give grace. It's a surprising first. And Jesus told her, for such a reply, you may go. The demon has already left your daughter. It's a surprising first, the first person to come to Jesus with empty hands, knowing their hands are empty, and yet still expecting blessing, is a Gentile, not even a Jewish person. And she accepts that she has no claim on Jesus, but is looking to him for grace with the empty hands of faith. Sometimes, if you've been in church for a long time, you can hear the gospel 100 times and it's lost its power in your life. You just hear somebody up front, and all you hear is God, Bible, Bible, God, Bible, God, Bible, Jesus, Bible, God, church, Bible, God, Jesus, Bible, God, church. And it just means nothing. But when the coin does drop, when the gospel does sink in, it's an incredibly powerful thing. You've heard this 1,000 times. It's like the old soda machine that used to be inside every single drugstore on the planet. You'd have the Coca-Cola version, and then you'd have the Pepsi product machine, and then you'd have maybe like Dr. Pepper, Mellow Yellow, Sun Kiss, Burst, something. I don't know what you all had in the Midwest, but there it is. And so I'll date myself. You put your 2 quarters in, and you don't hear anything. The coin doesn't drop. And so you push the button. It doesn't do anything. And you think, what's going on here? And so, of course, what do? Instinctively, you look around to make sure no management is looking at you. And then you grab this 5,000-ton piece of metal and shake it with all your heart until the coin drops. And the coin drops, then what do you get? You get your soda. And some of us, the gospel may be in there, but it hasn't dropped yet. And I'm praying that if that's where you are, and all you're hearing is God, Bible, Bible, God, Jesus, Bible, God, church, I'm praying that the coin drops, because it may already be in there. It just hasn't dropped. And so you haven't enjoyed your Mellow Yellow. Here, for this Phoenician woman, the coin has dropped. All you need is nothing. But most people don't have that. But she has nothing, and she knows it. And she's understanding Jesus brings grace. The first one to get it. This was at a time when Peter didn't even understand it. In the passage that Keith preached last week, Jesus talked about suffering and dying, and Peter pulls him aside, just going, the two of you, he's following Matthew 18, and rebukes him. And Jesus then rebukes Peter because he's thinking in human terms. He's not understanding grace. He's not understanding that Jesus is going to die in order to save us. It's a surprising first that this woman then went home and found her child lying on the bed and the demon gone. So we have this surprising first. We also have a deep identification here. Jesus continues north towards Sidon. He's traveling away from Jewish Palestine. He's traveling away from the religious leaders that are already plotting his death. He's going deeper into Gentile lands. And at some point, he turns east and southeast and goes towards the Decapolis, the 10 cities of which the greatest was Damascus. And there we read some people brought to him a man who was deaf and who could hardly talk. And what Jesus does next tells us a great deal about the character of Jesus. Notice Jesus pulls the man away from the crowd. Jesus took him aside, away from the crowd. This is a man who cannot speak and who cannot hear, and so all he can do is touch and see. And all his life, he's been stared at and talked about and pointed at and made fun of. His entire life he has been a spectacle. And here Jesus pulls him away from everybody else so that when he heals him, he will not be another spectacle yet again. The first thing he hears in his life will not be a whole bunch of people talking about how he was deaf. It shows an incredible identification that Jesus has with this man's suffering, that he's pulling him away in a way that he never does elsewhere in order to heal him, because he's understanding the emotional experience of what it would be like to have been a spectacle to other people your entire life. And then, God isn't toying with this man. I mean, if you want to see God, look at the face of Jesus. And there's an incredible tenderness and sensitivity there to our needs in the heart of Christ. In a fallen world, he's showing such tenderness. And then look at how Jesus communicates with him. Jesus could have just spoken the word and he would have been healed. But this man wouldn't have heard the word. He wouldn't have known what was going on. So what does Jesus do? God changes the way he communicates in order that we can understand. And here, Jesus is communicating to this guy, sticking his fingers in his ears, saying, see, I'm going to heal your ears. And then he puts his finger on the man's tongue to say, I am going to heal your tongue. This is the great physician. He's a physician who explains to his patient what he is about to do before he does it, and he does it in a way that he never does elsewhere because this man could not hear and could not speak. He wanted to lower the man's anxiety. And look at how Jesus groans as he speaks the word of healing. He looked toward heaven. The NIV says with a deep sigh. That's kind of weak. The Greek term is a groan. Kind of groan, almost growl. Something deep coming out of inner sadness or anger. In this case, probably sadness seems more likely, because Jesus is identified with this man to such a degree that he is feeling the man's despair. He is feeling all that this man has lost. He is feeling his pain. He is feeling everything. Jesus is identifying with him so closely with this man. It's a deep identification. We see a surprising the first person to understand grace is a Phoenician, and we see this deep identification that Jesus makes with weak and needy sinners like us and like this poor man. And yet we see something else here. We see here a deeper identification. Notice again how Jesus groans. He looked up to heaven, and with a deep sigh, he said to him, Ephphatha, a deep groan, Ephphatha, which means be opened. And at this, the man's ears were opened, and his tongue was loosened, and he began to speak plainly. What if Jesus isn't just groaning because he feels what this man has been feeling? What if there's something more? Something like Jesus' first miracle in John, when Mary came to Jesus at a wedding at Cana and said, Jesus, we're out of wine. And Jesus immediately says, why do you bring me into this? My hour is not yet here. Okay, that's like, when you say something to your spouse that seems really innocent and they blow up. That's what that is. Why? Because and you just have no clue. Sam's laughing. You know about his marriage, I guess. I don't, but obviously you all do now. When you say something that it hits a really deep emotional thing, and you're just like, I don't know what I just touched. That's what happened to Mary when she's like, oh, Jesus, we're out of wine. Could you whip up a miracle? It's like, why do you bring me into this? My hour is not yet here. My hour refers to the cross. And when Mary says that there's a poor family here that's out of wine and is getting ready to be humiliated before their guests, and they're obviously desperately poor, Jesus, when he says, okay, I'm going to do a miracle, his mind immediately goes to my hour, the cross. Because every bit of that grace, every healing is purchased at the cross. By his stripes, you are healed. Every time he has delivered you, every sin he has forgiven, every sickness he has healed, every one of those purchased at the cross. And so when Mary says we're out of wine, he immediately goes to the cross. And what if that's what's happening here? I think the deepness of this groan suggests that Jesus is already entering mentally into the cost of this man's healing. In Mark's gospel, the action is always moving rapidly toward the cross, toward Jerusalem, toward his death and resolved with his resurrection. And it's a deeper identification because Jesus is now identifying with this man as his Savior and as his substitute, knowing that he can heal this man, but Jesus will have to go to hell on the cross and be rejected so that you will never be rejected. By his stripes you are healed. And what's interesting here then is this reference to the prophecy of the Jewish prophet Isaiah, chapter 35 of Isaiah. Jesus uses the language from Isaiah 35 about himself, and then the people use the same language, and then Mark, as narrator, uses the same language. It's Isaiah 35 that when God comes to visit his people, the ears of the deaf will be opened. And we read here, Jesus said to the man, Ephphatha, which means be opened. And then Mark, as narrator, repeats the same thing. At this, the man's ears were opened. And then we hear the same thing from the crowd. You know, they're all witnessing it. They're talking among themselves. They're all seeing what's happening here. And they're overwhelmed with amazement. They say he's done everything well. He even makes the deaf hear and the mute speak. Isaiah 35, be strong and do not fear. Your God will come. He will come with vengeance and with divine retribution. He will come to save you. Then the ears of the deaf will be opened and the mouth of the mute will cry out. Isaiah 35, this is being fulfilled. God has come to his people. The ears of the deaf are open and the mouth of the mute is crying out. And that raises a question because Isaiah 35 didn't just say that God would come to his people again and the deaf will hear and the mute will speak. There was another detail you probably picked up on, something that didn't feel quite so warm and fuzzy. Isaiah 35, your God will come. He will come with vengeance. With divine retribution, he will come to save you. Then the ears of the deaf will be opened and the mouth of the mute will cry out. With vengeance, with divine retribution. What does that have to do with the ministry of Christ? Jesus would come with vengeance and with divine retribution against sin, but maybe not the way Isaiah's original hearers would have assumed. You see, when God comes to save, with the deaf and the lame seeing and being healed, as proof of his power to save, when God came to save with vengeance and divine wrath, he didn't come to pour that vengeance and wrath out upon us, but rather out upon himself. That's why Jesus had to die. I remember as a young, not quite believer in college, I was in process, and I had started going to this campus ministry, and there was this prayer group that met in, it was a big group that met in the chapel at the University of Virginia. It's the one Gothic building on a classical university. Mr. Jefferson would not have approved of either the architecture or the chapel, but it's right next to the rotunda, and everybody gathered on the stage, the chancel, to pray, you know, sitting on the floor, crisscross applesauce, as they say these days. And I remember somebody asking prayer for a friend of hers because they didn't understand why Jesus had to die. And I remember thinking, I have no clue why Jesus had to die. And it was only months later that I remember somebody explaining to me the cross and the notion of substitution, that there was judgment that I deserved, and Jesus wasn't going to let me face that. But he was going to take that sin, that weight upon his own shoulders, and let it crush him instead so that I could have the blessing that he deserved. Jesus tells us why he had to suffer and die. He began to teach them that the Son of God must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders, the chief priests, and the teachers of the law, and after that he must be killed, and after 3 days rise again. And Peter didn't get it yet, but Jesus had to die. The Son of God incarnate in Jesus, absorbing all of your sin and all of my sin, all of your shame and all of my shame, all of your illness and all of my illness, taking up our infirmities and bearing them on the cross in our place. It's like a picture of a judge whose own son is brought before him, and his son is guilty and pleads guilty, and he fines his son the maximum possible fine for his crime, and then steps down and walks to the bailiff and pays his son's fine for him. Only it wasn't money that had to be paid. It was the very life of the Son of God. See, true forgiveness always involves suffering for the person who does the forgiving. You know, when somebody destroys your reputation and you choose to forgive them, you don't get your reputation back. You have to pay down their debt every day the rest of your life. That may get you really angry. Why? Because you're paying their debt down for them. They're not paying their own debt down. You're doing it because you're the one forgiving. Forgiveness always has a cost, and it has a cost for God as well. And it cost him his son to be able to forgive us. There's always a cost. And for God, it was a very steep cost. And yet, God the Father gave up his son to gain the one thing that he wanted most, which is you. He paid off your debt because he wanted you. Matt Woodley tells a story about his friend Andy and his wife. They had traveled a couple decades ago to a South American country to complete the adoption for their little girl, and at the time this country was gripped by a lot of corruption and violence and real political chaos. And when Andy arrived, anyone who could profit from his plight took advantage of him. They kept upping the price for the adoption, the price for the legal fees, the price for transfers, the price for papers, the price to pay off this judge or that judge, even though it was all perfectly legal. And when Andy finally threatened to take the matter to the U.S. consulate, a mysterious figure came up to him and issued a death threat, telling him that he wouldn't make it out of the country alive if he brought the consulate into this. It was like a spy thriller, except it was this guy Andy and his wife who were caught in the middle of this sinister, dangerous plot. But he refused to leave the country without his daughter. The odd thing was that Andy had never actually even seen the little girl or met her. She was small. She was helpless. She hadn't won any awards. She hadn't aced any tests. She didn't know that one day Andy didn't know that one day her smile would light up their living room, or that she'd love their cats and dogs, or that she'd play Mozart pieces on the family piano. For all practical purposes, she was just an orphan condemned to a life of grinding poverty in a far-flung developing nation. But for some crazy reason, Andy stayed there. He let people take advantage of him. He let people use him. He negotiated with corrupt officials that were asking for money left and right. He spent tons of money that should not have had to be spent, absolutely letting himself be taken advantage of. His time was squandered, and he even risked his life in order to win this little baby girl. And 18 years later, Andy could talk about the intimate high school graduation party for his adopted daughter, Maria. And at one point during the meal, Maria unexpectedly stood up in front of everybody and gave a beautiful speech thanking everyone who had helped her find a better life on Long Island. And as Andy told the story, he was fighting back the tears, left the impression that he could have lived 100 more years or even 100 more lifetimes, and nothing would compare to hearing Maria say, "Thank you for spending so much of your life to come and rescue me." And it all started when Andy walked into a dangerous nightmare in an attempt to bring her home. Friends, that's what Jesus did for you. He left heaven itself to come into the most dangerous place possible, a bunch of religious people. And he let them take advantage of him. And they abused him. And they beat him. and they destroyed him, and they destroyed his reputation, and he let them do it, and he let him do it freely because he wanted to take you home. He loved you and was determined to stay in that nightmare however long it took in order to bring you home. Let's pray.